Hi, my name is Jessica Kenny, and I'm the manager of genetic counseling at Good Samaritan Hospital for Catholic Health. Today, I want to provide you with some information regarding cancer genetic counseling and testing so that you can decide if this is a service that would be appropriate for you. So let's get started. Today, we're going to be talking about hereditary cancer syndromes. And according to cancer.gov, a hereditary cancer syndrome is a type of inherited disorder in which there is a higher than normal risk of certain types of cancer. Hereditary cancer syndromes are caused by mutations, otherwise known as genes, in certain genes passed from parents to children. And in hereditary cancer syndromes, certain patterns of cancer can be seen within families. And these patterns can be seen in close family members, such as mothers, fathers, siblings, children, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Or we can see patterns on one side of the family or both sides of the family. What a change is in a gene that makes it a hereditary cancer syndrome, it's known as a pathogenic change, and that means it's a mutation. And so when this happens in specific genes, in this case it would be our cancer genes, then that would predispose an individual to increased risks of cancers over their lifetime. Cancer can be linked to a trait that can be passed down from one blood relative to another, and this mutation will increase the risks, but it does not guarantee that cancer will develop. Some of the names of some hereditary cancer syndromes are hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, Li-Fraumeni syndrome, Cowden syndrome, and Lynch syndrome. Some risk factors for hereditary cancer syndromes are ethnicity, so those that have Ashkenazi Jewish or Eastern European Jewish ancestry have a higher carrier rate. For mutations in the BRCA genes, BRCA is associated with breast cancer and ovarian cancer and some other cancers. And then those that have African American or Black ancestry are also at higher risks. Other risk factors include personal history of cancer. It would depend on ages of diagnosis, types of cancers, and whether there was a single type of cancer or multiple cancer diagnoses. And then family history of cancer is also extremely relevant. So when we do this type of testing, we look for multiple relatives on one side of the family with cancer, or relatives with multiple cancer diagnoses, or young ages of cancer diagnoses. Younger than 50 is usually our cutoff age that throws up the red flag for a hereditary cancer syndrome. And then, of course, another risk factor would be if an individual knows about a familial mutation in a cancer gene, such as a BRCA mutation or a mutation in a gene associated with Lynch syndrome. So let's take a step back and just talk about our genes for a moment to set some context. So our genes are our building blocks, or kind of like the written instruction booklet that tells our bodies how to grow, develop, and function properly. More technically, what our genes do is they write the instructions to create proteins, and then the proteins carry out the functions in our body. When it comes to cancer genetics, we actually divide cancer into two main categories, and those categories are hereditary cancer and sporadic cancer. You can see in this chart the sporadic piece of the pie is a much larger piece of the pie, and it actually accounts for about 85 to 90% of cancer diagnoses in the population. And they are just that. They're sporadic or spontaneous diagnosis of cancer that is likely due to an accumulation of risk factors that can catch up to us over time. The hereditary component, much smaller piece of the pie, only about 5 to 10% of cancer diagnoses in the population are considered hereditary. And since I just explained what a pathogenic mutation in a cancer gene is and would predispose an individual to increased risk of cancers, that's the hereditary cancer or the piece of the pie that we would be talking about. You do see a portion of familial cancer on this slide. It does not fall into the sporadic portion or the hereditary portion. So this is not a gene mutation that's being passed on in a family, but sometimes we do tend to see clusters of cancers in families. And with those families, you have to think about all the shared risk factors that they may have all encountered to contribute to their cancer diagnoses. So let's talk about risk factors in a moment, but first let's talk about types of mutations. So hereditary mutations are actually called germline mutations. Germ is another way of describing a reproductive cell. So the egg or the sperm cell are also called germ cells. If a parent is carrying a mutation and they pass it on through their reproductive cells or their germ cells, then the child who inherited that mutation has that mutation present in every single cell of their body. And you see on the left side of the screen the germline mutation. The individual is entirely shaded in. On the right side of the screen, we see somatic mutations. These are spontaneous mutations that can occur due to the accumulation of DNA damage through risk factors that we encounter through our lifetime. You can see the person in this picture only has a small spot on their shoulder shaded in, and that's a spontaneous mutation that occurred just in that spot in their body, but it's not present in their germ cells or their reproductive cells, so it's not going to be passed on to future generations. Now, what are some risk factors for sporadic cancers, or risk factors that can drive a hereditary cancer into development? So we have lifestyle factors and environmental exposures. Our lifestyle factors, or anything we do to our bodies or put into our bodies, including what we eat and drink, medications, hormones, even stress. And then environmental exposures can be general pollution in the air, or sometimes we know that we live near factories and they're not disposing of their waste ethically. Or sometimes we can call out some clear environmental exposures, such as maybe having a presence at Ground Zero following 9/11 doing cleanup for a number of days. But inevitably, we're all being exposed to lifestyle factors and environmental exposures, whether we're aware of it or not. So when cancer develops, the simplest definition of cancer is the uncontrolled growth of abnormal cells in the body. And what our cancer genes do is that they're actually supposed to repair DNA damage that we would incur through risk factors. But if there's a mutation in one of these cancer genes, then it can't properly perform that protective function or that DNA repair function to prevent us from developing cancer. And instead, it allows the cell to get confused, and the cell thinks that it's a normal cell when actually it's abnormal, and it starts replicating abnormally. And that's basically the development of cancer. Some testing criteria that individuals need to kind of adhere to or meet in order for their insurance companies to cover or consider genetic testing medically necessary for them. Criteria has been determined by national medical societies, such as the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, the United States Preventative Services Task Force, and the American Cancer Society, the American Radiology Society, and the American Society of Breast Surgeons. And some syndrome-specific are hereditary breast and ovarian cancers associated with BRCA1 and 2 genes. There are moderate risk breast cancer genes that would also fall under that hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome title, but they're not BRCA genes. They are separate genes that are associated with breast cancers or other cancers. Lynch syndrome is another hereditary cancer syndrome, familial adenomatous polyposis, in which we're developing lots of colon polyps and have a high risk of developing colon cancer. Li-Fraumeni is a very concerning cancer syndrome where cancers can start very early in an individual's lifetime, and almost every type of cancer can develop. And then hereditary diffuse gastric cancer is a very sneaky type of stomach cancer. It's also associated with breast cancer. So some direct indications for genetic testing would be breast cancers or any cancer under the age of 50. Sticking with breast cancers, triple negative breast cancer under the age of 60, bilateral breast cancers, metastatic breast cancer, or breast cancer in Ashkenazi Jewish individuals, or male breast cancer. Some other cancers that we look to for direct indication for genetic testing would be ovarian cancer at any age, pancreatic cancer at any age, and a high-grade or metastatic prostate cancer at any age. And then we look for, or red flags come up for us when we see cancers such as colon cancer, uterine cancer under the ages of 50, or skin cancers under the ages of 40 or 30. And of course, a direct indication would be whether a first or second degree relative in the family already has a genetic mutation and you want to find out if you carry it as well. So what this slide shows is family trees. So what's extremely important when we do genetic testing for hereditary cancer syndromes is to capture family history. You can see what this shows is a family tree. 2 family trees are here, and we see 2 different types of cancers, or multiple different types of cancers being shown in both trees. On the right, you see a BRCA family with breast cancers and prostate cancers. On the left, there's no mutation in that family, but you see colon and ovarian cancers. We do this, it's a visual tool for the genetic counselor to indicate whether there's a pattern of cancer on one or both sides of the family, what the risk is for us to figure out whether there is a hereditary cancer syndrome, and it also gives us a clue as to what genes we would want to include in our test. Some of the inheritance patterns that we would talk to you about during your session would be a dominant inheritance pattern or a recessive inheritance pattern. So a dominant inheritance pattern is actually the most common type of inheritance pattern when it comes to cancer genes. So what this means is we all have 2 copies of every one of our genes because we get 1 copy from mom, 1 copy from dad. And if one of our parents was carrying a mutation in one of their genes, the mutation would only be present in one of the 2 copies. And that's where the word dominant comes from, because you only need 1 copy to have a mutation in it. But from an inheritance perspective, each time we have children, we can only pass on 1 copy of our genes because our partner passes on the 2nd copy. So the individual who has a mutation in one of the 2 copies, each time they pass, or each time they have children, they either pass the healthy copy or the mutated copy. So that makes it a 1 in 2 chance or a 50% risk to all first-degree relatives. Obviously that includes their children, but that would also include their siblings or their parents. A recessive inheritance pattern is somewhat rare in cancer genes, but what it means is both parents carry mutations on one of the 2 copies of their cancer gene, and then what you can see below those 2 parents is the individual in orange. The individual in orange inherited both mutated copies, 1 from each parent, so the individual in orange has both mutated copies of a cancer gene. And what that equates to is a 25% risk that children can be affected, 25% chance that a child is not a carrier or is not affected, that's the blue individual all the way to the left, and then a 50% chance that the children are carriers just like their parents, and you see those in the middle. Why come to a genetic counselor when you're considering genetic testing? Well, we are board certified. What that means is that we have a very hefty education in medical genetics and psychosocial counseling. We are required to obtain master's degrees in medical genetics, and then we take board exams to make sure that we can sufficiently process the education that we've learned. And then we start practicing. And genetic counselors are the individuals that are the experts in genetics. They can tell you everything you need to know about genetics or hereditary phenomenons. And what genetic counselors do is we guide and support patients interested in understanding how inherited diseases may affect their or their family members' health. We do a comprehensive review of your personal medical history. We do a comprehensive review of your family history, and that's the family tree that I just showed. We also do a psychosocial history, so we want to assess if you have any psychosocial issues or emotional barriers that would make learning, if you're affected with a hereditary cancer syndrome, more emotional for you. We talk about cancers, we talk about genetics, we talk about genes, we talk about inheritance patterns, we talk about testing, we talk about the benefits and the limitations of testing, and the whole process with a genetic counselor is an informed consent process. And this part is really important. When you do a genetic test, you should be properly informed to what you're being consented to so you understand what the potential results might mean for you and family members. Then we'll move on and we'll facilitate the testing. When the results do come back, we will talk to the patients about the results, so we interpret their results for them. And then we provide recommendations as to whether we can either prevent cancer or catch it early. So I'm going to go through those in detail in a little bit. Genetic testing is performed if an individual meets criteria. If they don't meet criteria, but they have a concerning suspicion based on cancers in the family, they can pay out of pocket because it is very affordable these days. And then DNA is obtained either through their blood or their saliva. The samples are sent out to very specialized genetic testing labs, and it takes about 2 to 3 weeks for the DNA to be analyzed. And when results are back, we have one of 3 results. A positive result indicates that the lab positively identified a mutation in one of the genes, and then we're talking about how to prevent cancers in the future. A negative result indicates no mutations were found in any of the genes, and the genes are normal. This means we did not find a hereditary factor. And a variant of uncertain significance is a third type of a result. It's somewhat of an inconclusive result. What it means is that a change was identified in a gene, but the lab that analyzed the DNA doesn't have enough data right now to know whether that change is normal and benign to that individual, or if it's harmful and we should be concerned about it anytime we see it. Usually those changes are benign. So if we see those changes, we consider them negative until the labs can reclassify them. And they do that by gathering more data, by finding the same change in the same gene, by testing more people. Some limitations for genetic testing would be a negative result. Doesn't give us answers as to why a cancer diagnosis occurred in an individual or in a family. Also, a negative result does not mean that we will never develop cancer. Remember, sporadic cancers account for 85 to 90% of cancer diagnoses in the population. So if we do genetic testing and we get normal results, it doesn't mean that we won't develop cancer. We are still at risk, unfortunately. Variants of uncertain significance are sometimes difficult for other healthcare providers to understand. Unfortunately, other healthcare providers don't have an extensive genetic education like your genetic counselors do. So always listen to your genetic counselor about your variant of uncertain significance. Insurance discrimination can sometimes occur if someone has a positive genetic test result. This is really more so associated with life insurance, long-term care, and disability insurance, but there is no discrimination associated with medical insurance. Sometimes we do genetic testing and we have an unclear utility of the results. So sometimes we'll get back what's called an incidental result, where we find a mutation in a gene associated with a different cancer type than what we developed, or a different cancer type than what was present in the family. And sometimes that leaves us wondering, but we can still provide recommendations. And then sometimes, because genetics is a moving target in research and development, we find positive results in genes that we don't have guidelines in yet because there's limited research. So sometimes we just need a little bit of extra time to get some guidelines to be able to recommend to individuals. Sometimes a positive result doesn't account for personal or family history. That kind of goes back to unclear clinical utility. As I said before, this is a detailed informed consent process only if you go through a genetic counselor. And then insurance coverage sometimes is restrictive, but it's vastly improving. And as I said before, genetic testing is a lot more affordable these days. What this list shows is a gene of lists, and I just have different colors showing that the genes are listed on the left column, and then what you're seeing across the other columns, there's a pink, a purple, a blue, a green, an orange, a red column. So what you're seeing is that if we found a mutation in that first gene, which is a BRCA1 gene, it's associated with increased risks for breast cancers, ovarian cancers, prostate cancers, and pancreatic cancers. So you can see what this list is showing is that mutations in certain genes don't only increase our risk for one type of cancer, they can potentially increase our risks for multiple types of cancers. So we would provide recommendations based on the results, which I just kind of went through before. And this is kind of what the recommendations would look like. So we're either recommending prophylactic surgeries to reduce cancer risks by removing healthy organs, such as a risk-reducing bilateral mastectomy, or a total hysterectomy with removal of the fallopian tubes and the ovaries. Some very high-risk colon cancer syndromes require the removal of the entire colon. And that hereditary diffuse gastric cancer syndrome that I mentioned before requires the removal of the stomach. Those are very drastic recommendations, and they are only associated with a very small portion of gene mutations. More commonly, we're giving recommendations for surveillance. So we're making recommendations to start screenings either at earlier ages, or we're recommending additional screenings such as a breast MRI in addition to a breast mammogram, because these other screenings might be more sensitive than what we're already doing. Or we can recommend screenings at certain frequencies. So general population goes for colonoscopies every 5 to 10 years. We might recommend that you go for colonoscopies every 1 to 2 years. Or there's specific medications that we can sometimes recommend that you talk to your doctors about maybe taking to prevent certain cancer risks. Sometimes there are treatment recommendations that can come into play as well. So the presence or absence of mutations in certain genes can give us an indication as to whether we can use certain chemotherapies or immunotherapies. And then the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act is the federal law that provides protection for individuals if they test positive for genetic mutations, so that they cannot be discriminated against in the settings of their medical insurance or their employment. However, this law does not cover life insurance, long-term care, and disability insurance. So if an individual has a positive genetic test result and does not already have life insurance in place, that can potentially prevent them from getting life insurance. So in summary, we all have cancer genes. It's part of the 20 to 30,000 genes that we have in our bodies and every single cell of our bodies that make us humans. So when we do genetic counseling, we talk about our genes, we talk about cancer risks, and we talk about how we test the genes that are already in our bodies to see if they are normal or if they have defects, otherwise known as mutations, in them. And if we find those mutations, then we provide recommendations for cancer prevention or cancer screenings. And again, it's always important for you to do genetic testing through a genetic counselor. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we hope to see you in the future.